On a holiday weekend in 2003, a woman was working overtime to get a project across the finish line for her employer. When her digital footprint trailed off and loved ones failed to hear from her, both her friends and colleagues grew concerned. Concern that was merited when a grisly discovery in the nearby Green River revealed that she met a horrific end to her life. Those closest to her believe the answer to who killed her is obvious. But despite this shared belief, nearly 23 years have passed without an arrest. I'm your host, Megan, and each week on A Simpler Time True Crime, I cover older unsolved cases and challenge the idea that a simpler time means a safer time. This week, I'm bringing to you the unsolved murder of Jone Knapton. At the top of this episode, I want to provide a brief content warning that the details around the murder of Jone are difficult to hear, and unfortunately, some of the graphic details are impossible to avoid to tell her case, so please take care when listening. And as always, anybody discussed as a possible suspect in this podcast is innocent until proven guilty in the court of law. So, let's get into it. 4th of July was a big celebration typically for 46-year-old Jone Knapton and her family. They would run the East Moline Firecracker 5K, they'd go to the parade together, and then they would all cram in one backyard to cook out and swim. But on the 4th of July weekend in 2003, where the 4th fell on a Friday, Jone had to sit this one out. Her daughter Nicole, actually, who was living a few hours away at school, had actually contacted her mom to see about coming home to visit that weekend. She wanted to bring her boyfriend to her hometown and show him how her hometown celebrated the 4th of July. East Moline is a Mississippi River city in western Illinois and part of the Quad Cities, known for its manufacturing roots, strong working-class identity, and ongoing riverfront revitalization. And that riverfront area is what Nicole wanted to share with her boyfriend. This tugged at the heartstrings of Jone Knapton. It's hard for a mom of a college-age student to turn down a visit, but she let her know this actually wasn't the best weekend for it. You see, she was working on a project for her employer. And even though it was the 4th of July weekend, Jone had deadlines to meet, and she was working through them with a handful of her colleagues. She was working from her laptop from home on that Friday the 4th. She was a computer programmer at Coney Inc., and I'm hoping I'm saying that properly. I heard it pronounced that way on a couple of newscasts, but it is a global company that designs and manufactures elevators. Jone was known as a workaholic, and she would do anything to meet a deadline, even if it meant working through a holiday weekend. So that's what she was doing. She worked away on the project all Friday and actually had been in touch with her colleague she was working on the project with into that evening, and I mean deep into that evening. They last heard from her over the phone at 10 p.m., and they were still working and approaching a nearby deadline. For most of us, this would be rather unusual, but in this case, that's what made Jone and her lack of response pop out so early, because they were actually concerned when she stopped responding and missed one of their check-in deadlines at midnight on the 5th. At that point, her computer showed as logged off, which was out of character for her. She didn't respond all of that Saturday on the 5th, which was highly out of character. Also on the 5th, her daughter began to worry too because she couldn't reach her mom, and they spoke every single day. So when it became known on Sunday that nobody had heard from her since Friday night, the family and her employer alerted police, who initiated an investigation. When they showed up for a welfare check, there were no signs of obvious disturbance at the house. From what I can tell from reporting, she had 2 vehicles, a white minivan, which was still parked in her driveway, and a car, which was still parked in her garage. There was no blood in her home, no forced entry, and no sign of a struggle. But her beloved cats were not fed, something Jone would never allow to happen. Police began trying to locate her and put a missing persons bulletin out to the media. Jone Knapton was described as 5 foot 8 inches tall, 130 pounds, with blonde hair and brown eyes. She had told her daughter she planned to be home all weekend. She lived in a safe, upper-middle-class neighborhood in East Moline, and she currently was living alone. I'll have a picture of her house on the Instagram at simplertimecrimepod, as well as the neighborhood. You'll see it's a typical subdivision, and it's no place that you would think would have a lot of issues just looking at it. But going back to the living alone piece, you see there's a catch, because Jone had been married since April of 1982 to a man named Larry Knapton, who was around her age, a few years older than her. The two had one daughter, Nicole, and there had been trouble in their marriage for a bit. But it all came to a head, and on April 18th, 2003, just 3 months before her disappearance, Jone filed for divorce from Larry. Jone cited that Larry had been, quote, guilty of a course of conduct which, under the last of the state of Illinois, constitutes extreme and repeated mental cruelty. Larry had been living in Chicago, 2.5 hours away from East Moline, Monday through Friday for work, but it did say he would come back to East Moline on weekends. My understanding of this was that he was definitely doing that leading up to the divorce. I'm unsure if after she filed for divorce, this arrangement was still happening. But I would assume that he had keys to her home, and that's going to be important. The initial court hearing for their divorce was supposed to occur on August 12, 2003. Everything changed on Thursday, July 10th, when a second investigation began unfolding in this typically quiet area with very little history of violent crime. A motorist driving north of East Moline made a grisly discovery while crossing a bridge. On Thursday, July 10th, while East Moline investigators were still searching for Jone Knapton and interviewing people as to her whereabouts, a motorist driving on State Route 82 in the town of Geneseo, Illinois, was about to have anything but an ordinary day. While crossing the bridge going over the Green River at around 2 p.m., they spotted something shocking. What they thought were human remains floating in the river. The driver contacted authorities, and investigators and local news media rushed to the scene. Once there, Henry County investigators called in East Moline authorities. The law enforcement departments were very careful not to speculate on if the body found in the river was that of the missing Jone Knapton. And there was a huge hindrance to any identification because what was found in the water was actually just a torso. They could not determine if the torso belonged to a man or woman or anything else really. Given the out-of-the-ordinary situation, the press was trying desperately to get as close as possible to the roped-off scene. And one property owner who had a rugged land area that backed up to the river agreed to take a journalist to the banks of the river via his ATV. And as they approached, they spotted something else in the water, and they couldn't make sense of it at first. But as it turns out, it was a human leg. This was something very traumatizing for the landowner because, as it turns out, the way the investigation, how they were releasing information, this landowner, he really wasn't thinking he was disrupting anything major. He thought that maybe a fisherman had some sort of mishap, and he just was like, sure, I'll take this news guy down here. But then to see this and discover that, that's just something that people are not supposed to see. They continued to try to secure the scene and secure how the information was getting out there and control the narrative. And they get to this kind of weird part of the investigation because there is a solid chance this is the missing Jone Knapton. But you can't bank on that and also not continue looking for her. So they have one investigation going, still trying to find her outside of this while wondering if this really could be her and considering strongly that it may be. The scene was made up of 15 to 20 deputies, search personnel, firefighters, and emergency staff gathered along the riverbank. It was a real blend of different people. There was the Illinois State Crime Lab, the Illinois State Police, Geneseo Police, Geneseo Fire, Henry County Sheriff's Department, and more. They also had a yellow raft in the river looking for, unfortunately, it's so horrible to talk about, but more of this person's body parts. There was a Med Force helicopter who volunteered to fly overhead and take aerial photos. The Henry County coroner came to the scene and pronounced the victim deceased at 3:37 p.m. One thing I personally found a little odd about how they interacted with the media around it was that they were saying, the investigator was saying, it's a coincidence. And that felt really definitive. I understand saying we can't fully determine if the partially dismembered remains are the missing person. I get that. But saying, oh, yeah, no chance, felt a little bit too definitive for what they knew. They were quick to point out that there were other missing persons in the area, such as 32-year-old Gary James Swanson Jr., who had disappeared from the area in May. There was also 27-year-old Matthew Gold, who had disappeared from the area in 2001. But to play devil's advocate here, Matthew Gold had disappeared a couple of years prior, as I just said. So I think you could tell the difference between a body or partial remains that had been in the water for just a few days versus 2 years. And also Gary James Swanson Jr., the other man I was talking about, he is 6'8" and well over 250 pounds and a male. So I think there's an obvious difference in the appearance of what his torso would look like versus a woman who is 5'8" and 130 pounds. But I digress. On Saturday, July 12th, an autopsy was conducted by forensic pathologist Larry Blum. He was able to confirm that the victim was a white female, but he said he couldn't identify her or reveal at that time her cause of death. DNA samples were collected to send off to the lab to see if the body was that of Jone Knapton. Other samples were taken for toxicology. It was said that the DNA results could take weeks because cases ready to go to trial got expedited testing. It was also announced that a coroner's inquest would be held at a later date. On Monday the 14th, investigators attempted to search the river again for more of the remains, but the river was swollen and the banks were overflowing due to recent heavy rain. The water was incredibly murky, and dredging the water was unsuccessful. They had to call off this search and hoped that the river would give up the rest of the remains with time. It was revealed that investigators had found the torso with both arms attached. Both legs were found separately and detached, but they were unable to recover the victim's feet, hands, neck, or head. This is speculation on my part, but it does seem like these were the most identifying body parts where you could have gotten victims' fingerprints or visibly recognize the victim's face. The lack of finding them makes me think that it was more than just a coincidence that those body parts didn't surface or wash up in the river. In fact, it made me wonder if they were in that river at all. On July 20th, 2003, investigators from East Moline and Henry County pulled together with a public plea for information in both cases. Henry County had taken the lead on the investigation into the discovery of the body parts in the Green River, and East Moline was investigating the disappearance of Jone. Detectives were working 10 to 12-hour days, running down information. But it would take several weeks until Thursday, October 21st, when DNA results would take the case in the next direction. On Thursday, August 21st, the body found in the Green River was confirmed to be that of missing Jone Knapton. Jone's family and large circle of friends, they were devastated, but in some ways had a slight bit of relief to just have some answers, at least this answer, and at least be able to place her to rest. Her obituary announced the plans for her funeral, which interestingly enough asked that in lieu of flowers, donations be made to the Quad City chapter of Family Resource Domestic Violence Advocacy Program. The funeral was the week following at Jone's church, the St. Anne Catholic Church in East Moline. Her obituary talked about her love of exercising, golfing, shopping, scuba diving, riding her bike, traveling, and love for her daughter Nicole, especially watching Nicole bowl. At this time, police would not reveal any suspects that they had, or even if they had any. But it was released that the attorney who had been representing Jone in her divorce would now be representing her family in further legal proceedings. His name was Arthur Winstein. But while police may not have been mentioning suspects themselves, her family made it known in most interviews who they believed it was. They never mentioned him really by name, but as I keep this going and share their comments, I think you'll get the hint. But first, let's discuss the coroner's inquest. It was held on Friday, October 3rd, 2003, and a few things did come out of it. First, they said that her body was in the water for 5 days and that they believed she was killed either late Friday evening on July 4th or sometime on the 5th, and that her body was placed in the water on the 5th. They emphasized that they were never able to find the missing body parts, only her torso with arms attached and the legs, which were found early on. Now, interestingly, her blood alcohol content was 0.125 at the time of her death. Something to be aware of is that after a person dies, their blood alcohol concentration can sometimes rise due to the natural process of decomposition. Once the immune system shuts down, bacteria, particularly from the gut, begin spreading through the body and breaking down tissues. In doing so, they can ferment sugars and produce ethanol, the same type of alcohol found in alcoholic beverages. And what this means is that this process, known as postmortem ethanol production, can artificially elevate a person's BAC, even if they had little or nothing to drink before death. To account for this, medical examiners don't rely on a single blood sample, and so they can usually narrow this down a bit to get a better understanding of how drunk a person was or wasn't. However, I want to make note that none of this was discussed in what was released to the public, so I personally am unclear if they believe Jone was drinking that night or if this BAC was influenced by decomposition. And why I think this is relevant is, did she have a guest over briefly who she had a couple of drinks with? I don't know Jone to know if she was the type of person who would have had a glass of wine while wrapping up a little work. That would be speculation on my part. But if she did, that BAC is way more than sipping on one glass of wine. And I say that from no place of judgment. My BAC has been way more than one glass of wine. I'm only saying it from if that was her true BAC, I just wonder what the events were that night leading up to it is all. I think it gives clues as to her final moments. Not much more was released from the inquest, including how she got in the river, how specifically she was dismembered, or any thoughts on motive for the crime. At this time, Jone's sister Lisa told the paper that she believed she knew who was responsible, but that given the nature and details of the crime, she felt that more than one person had to be involved. Weeks passed, and in November of 2003, police requested that people who lived, fished, and farmed in the area be on the lookout for any unusual items. They revealed that of the body parts they were able to recover, particularly the torso, that it was nude. So they believed there was clothing out there along with the missing body parts and other personal items that may have been discarded in the rural parts of the region. They also believed that the Green River may still hold key pieces of evidence that just had not washed ashore, so that's why they were leveraging the help of local fishermen. As months passed, the family became more transparent in hinting about who they felt was responsible and how frustrated they were understandably getting. In October of 2003, her sister, Lisa Mickelson, told the press she was losing hope by the day. She said, quote, "I can't believe my sister was taken from her home and nobody is going to be held accountable." She also added about the police, quote, "I think they've worked hard on it, but I don't believe anyone can be intelligent enough to get away with this type of murder. Every day the case gets colder," end quote. Lisa added that her sister had no enemies and many friends, and that she was busy and in the prime of her life. But no matter what, she would always make time to help anyone. In February of 2004, Lisa discussed with the papers the parallels she saw between the murder of Laci Peterson and her sister Jone, even saying it was, quote, "the exact same murder, regardless of who did it, detail by detail," end quote. And she's not wrong. There are a lot of parallels, other than the fact that Laci was pregnant when she went missing. But they both went missing and were found dismembered in bodies of water shortly after their disappearance. Both women's heads were never found. And in a strange twist, Lisa Mickelson and Laci Peterson's sister, Amy Rocha, were both hairstylists. Now, in the 2002 murder of Laci Peterson, her husband Scott was found guilty of her murder. And I think using this case as an example of an almost identical case implies strongly who Lisa and her family think should be considered the prime suspect in Jone's case. Lisa told the Rock Island Argus in her interview, quote, "It's hard in your subconscious not to feel nervous when they're walking the streets." In June of 2004, just ahead of the one-year anniversary, a new task force was formed for Jone's case, and it expanded the investigation. It included 15 to 20 Illinois State Police detectives, aside East Moline Police detectives. Their goal was to re-examine the evidence, re-interview people, and see if they could come up with something fresh. Then, a few weeks later, at the one-year anniversary, the Carol Sund Carrington Memorial Reward Foundation offered up a $5,000 reward in Jone's case. Crime Stoppers had already put up a $1,000 reward, so this brought everything up to $6,000. This particular reward foundation was formed in memory of the victims from the 1999 Yosemite killings. And the Carrington family founded the Reward Foundation to provide financial resources for families who otherwise couldn't afford substantial rewards to generate tips in missing persons cases or homicides. Jone's family hadn't previously considered the reward piece, but they definitely took this organization up on their offer. And it was after that that a group of Jone's friends took action. She had a huge group of close-knit friends. They affectionately called themselves the Dirty Dozen, and they had been best friends for years. They felt that as much as they were appreciative of this $5,000 reward in conjunction with the other $1,000, that this still was just not enough given how significant this case was. So they pulled together to do a fundraiser in October of 2004. They held a raffle fundraiser, and they raised an additional $34,000 of reward money, bringing the reward up to $40,000 for information. The family was so appreciative of this friend group, who regularly spoke to the media, set up vigils, kept Jone's name out there. And from what I can tell, they still do. If any of you are listening, please feel free to reach out to me if there's anything else I should share about Jone. I'm always willing to do bonus content and put more of people out there from when they were still here. Unfortunately, the money did not motivate anybody to come forward. Let's talk about the task force for a moment, though. That was pulled together for 5 weeks, and during that time, they interviewed about 100 people over again. Some new people, some were re-interviews. but they didn't get a whole lot of new information. And don't get me wrong, Jone's family, they were appreciative of the task force, but they just wished it came together sooner. They said that some of the details they were asking people about were no longer fresh in their minds. Each 4th of July, including as the second one drew closer, the family of Jone held a candlelight vigil instead of their usual routines, and Crime Stoppers would put out a renewed plea for information in her case. Crime Stoppers was hopeful. They told the media that anniversary pieces sometimes jogged people's memories and helped stir up conversation, and that they personally knew cold cases that had been solved in that way. As you know, part of why I do these podcast episodes is for that reason exactly. Outside of anniversary timeframes, I cover these old cases to get people talking again and generate information. At least that's my goal. But 2005 would not be just another year that the case grew cold, because the next major thing happened in August of 2005, with an arrest outside of but adjacent to Jone's case. On Friday, August 19th, 2005, Larry Knapton, the estranged husband of Jone Knapton, was arrested in the small town of Anita, Iowa, 239 miles away from East Moline. The Cass County, Iowa Sheriff's Department arrested him on an outstanding warrant from authorities in Lake County, Illinois. You see, Lake County had obtained a search warrant for Larry's computer related to Jone's case, and while going through it, they found something that shouldn't be there. He was arrested on 6 counts of possessing child pornography, and his extradition hearing would be August 22nd. His bail, $800,000. Just weeks after that, in September of 2005, new revelations would come out about Jone and Larry's daughter, Nicole, who was 22 at this point. She was 20 and in college when her mom was murdered. It was revealed that she was terrified of her father and had an order of protection granted in August of 2003, just after her mother's murder. Because she cited her father as being a suspect in her mother's murder in 2003, and police did not want this to be revealed to the public, they sealed this order of protection and all of the court records from the public. At this time in 2005, she was at yet another hearing trying to keep this order of protection in place. She was fearful because of financial motivations she felt could place her in danger. She was the only possible heir to any assets or her mother's estate, and she felt she could be seen as getting in the way of those for her father to have them. How sad must that be for her to reconcile? Not only has she lost her mother, she has to be afraid that her father did this to her mother and afraid that he may do something to her. That is just so sad. And if you're listening, Nicole, I'm so sorry this has been a part of your life and something you've had to deal with. Nicole said that after her mother's death, her father began trying to call her and email her regularly, something that was out of character for him, and it was making her fearful. She said that the weekend after her mother's disappearance, police from an undisclosed location, we don't know if it was state police or the local police, but someone from police contacted her and said, "Hey, your father's heading your way." Her father drove halfway to her home and then inexplicably, it seems, turned around, but he then drove another route to her house 5 hours away and came back looking for her specifically. He spent hours in her apartment parking lot waiting for her, which she said made her afraid of what he was there for and what he might do. And she actually requested the assistance of local police to deal with him. In the request for the order of protection, she said, quote, "I am very worried that he may harm me due to what has happened to my mother, and because I am my mother's only heir. In past incidents, my father has been very mentally abusive as well as verbally. I have heard him call my mother severe, mean names, trying to hurt her image and feelings," end quote. At this time in 2005, Given the state of the child pornography case and likely the passage of time, the judge deemed it no longer necessary to just seal this information. And so it became public. And it should be noted that at this point, this was the only time Larry Knapton had been mentioned as a person of interest or suspect in Jone's murder. When we talk about the financial piece, Jone was making around $100,000 at the time of her murder annually, and this was back in 2003. Now, $100,000, that's still a nice salary today in 2026, but even more so back then. It's estimated she'd likely be making more like $176,000 in today's money. So she was successful, she was out earning her husband, and she was also reportedly the only person listed on the deed to the house. So he was definitely in a financial pickle. He was at a financial disadvantage in comparison to her as they were going through these divorce proceedings. In May of 2006, the Hartford Life Group insurance policy, who held Jone's employer-based $100,000 policy, filed a lawsuit essentially saying they couldn't pay out the policy as ordered to Larry because he was a suspect in the case. And they basically said, take us out of it. We don't want any part of it. They need to sort it out amongst themselves, they being Larry and his daughter, Nicole. At this time, Jone's sister commented, quote, "It always continually says that my sister's death is unsolved, which is untrue. It remains untried. This is not a mystery. Larry doesn't have the right to that money," end quote. Nicole informed the Hartford group that she would be making a claim on the policy as her mother's heir. But ultimately, the two came to a settlement, and infuriatingly, Larry Knapton received most of the benefit. In 2007, Larry's trial for the child pornography charges ended in a mistrial, and authorities opted not to refile charges. I wish I had more information on this, but it was very limited. In the years following, justice has continued to be evaded in Jone's case. Her family tried to hire a private investigator with some of the reward money, but police said they were unwilling to work with this specific investigator because of his sketchy reputation. I found an interesting article in September of 2011. There was an article in the Rock Island Argus about the retirement of a longtime Illinois State Police crime scene investigator named Tom Murchie. And he was asked about a lot of the different cases he may have touched on or been a part of. And he was actually asked about Jone's case. And he said, quote, "To me, that's solved. It's just not resolved. We've got physical evidence. There's no doubt in my mind who did it. It's just having the right piece of evidence there. There's just lots and lots of circumstantial evidence," end quote. So there you have it. But even still, nearly 23 years have passed since Jone's brutal murder, and nobody has been arrested. Her daughter is almost the same age her mother was when she died, and she has had to live all of these years without her. Larry spoke to the media once early in the investigation, and when asked if he murdered his wife, he said, quote, "Of course not, but I can't talk about it." According to investigators, he was interviewed and agreed to talk once early in the investigation, and then he never cooperated again after that. Some random Reddit threads will talk about Larry Knapton and say he had an alibi that checked out, but I have yet to find any available, reliable source material that says Larry Knapton had an alibi and was cleared. In a 2021 interview, Police Captain Chris Endress with the Illinois State Police said, quote, "All the evidence at the scene indicates that this was a planned, targeted event, not a random act of violence. In any homicide, the person's spouse is going to be a person of interest. Certainly in this case, Larry Knapton remains our primary person of interest in this case. On July 8th, when we went to meet him in Lake County to let him know his wife was missing, he spoke with us on that day. And after that conversation, he's never fully participated since. And I'll also add that he's never inquired with us on the status of the investigation either. I'm not here to say Larry's responsible for this. I'm saying that he's a person of interest and we want to bring justice for Jone, and his participation in the investigation would be a huge benefit to us, but he hasn't fully participated yet." End quote. At the time of this recording, nobody has been held criminally responsible in the death of Jone Knapton. In article after article, you can hear her family say how much they continued fearing that a lack of justice in her case would occur. And now they are living that out still 2 decades later. So please help this family out. If you have any information on the murder of Jone Knapton, contact the Crime Stoppers out of the Quad Cities at 309-762-9500. This has been another episode of A Simpler Time True Crime. If you appreciate the work I'm doing, please leave a 5-star review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Tell friends about it, share it on social media, and if you want to support the show monetarily, you can join my Spreaker Supporters Club. You just have to scroll to the bottom of the show notes, and then you'll see the link to join. From there, I'm adding bonus episodes in, and you can get any of my back episodes and future episodes ad-free. Follow me on Instagram at simplertimecrimepod. I also have TikTok, Facebook, and some others, but really my Instagram is where I post all my week in, week out photos that go along with each case. If you have case suggestions, please email me, simplertimecrimepod@gmail.com. And as always, thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you again next Monday.